It's The World This Week, The World This Week in partnership with The Daily Beast. Joining us, France 24 Chief International Affairs Editor Robert Parsons. How are you?
Okay, good.
Also pleased to welcome France 24 Moscow correspondent Elena Volochin, gracing us with her presence here in Paris. How are you?
Hi, Francois.
From Istanbul, Borzo Daragahi, international correspondent for English newspaper The Independent. How are you?
Good. Great to be here.
And from Jerusalem, correspondent Iris Makler. How are things?
Yes, good.
Oh, good to hear it. You can, by the way, subscribe and like us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and other fine streaming services here at The World This Week. 1 month after the shock of Russia invading Ukraine, how's Vladimir Putin's war going? Territorial gains? No question. Near total control of the skies? Definitely. But there hasn't been the blitzkrieg that many thought would happen. A quick grab of Kyiv. No fatal blow to Ukraine's defenses on the quick. Instead, Ukraine proving its resilience. News like this one, the destruction of a Russian landing support ship in the Russian-occupied port of Berdiansk. Berdiansk, strategically located to the west of the besieged city of Mariupol in the Sea of Azov. I don't know if you could see the Sea of Azov from Istanbul, but Borzo Daragahi, those pictures, and by the way, they've been confirmed by the Pentagon that it was indeed taken out by the Ukrainians. What does that tell you?
I mean, I think it points to and underscores the kind of old-fashionedness of the Russian way of war, moving heavy equipment. It's almost like they are fighting World War II and the Ukrainians are fighting a more of a sort of special forces, guerrilla-style operation. And, you know, I think that they need to, I mean, I'm not a military guy, but I think they really need to update their doctrine because they are not apparently accounting for issues such as force protection and things like that the Americans are obsessed with, having spent a lot of time with them. How could you bring a massive ship into that area without securing control of the immediate area first? It's just basics for modern warfare, especially at a time when countries like Ukraine and other countries have tools like drones that are quite adept at taking out very large pieces of equipment when used correctly.
Robert Parsons, Russia, is it fighting the war along an old playbook? Is that what's happening?
Yeah, I think it is. Incidentally, I'm not sure that the Russians do have near total control of the air at this stage. I mean, I came back 2 weeks ago, it's true, and things have changed since then, but there was virtually no Russian aerial presence the whole time I was there that I could see over Kyiv. Things have changed certainly in the last couple of weeks, but the air defense system being operated by the Ukrainians has been extremely effective, using the missiles that they're getting from Western countries, from the United Kingdom, from the US, and so on. But to go to your question, it is an old-fashioned approach, you know, that sort of siege of cities. It's falling back on the tried methods that the Russians have used since the 1990s, when they had the First Chechen War, Second Chechen War. Everybody was thinking after the rather labored performance of the Russian army in Georgia in 2008 and the reforms that were introduced and the massive amount of money that was spent, that a new Russian armed forces was beginning to emerge. And there was some suggestion after the operations in Crimea, when they didn't actually have to do any fighting, remember, that the Russian army was suddenly much more professional. But what we're seeing in Ukraine is it's not really the case. And often they're still relying on conscripts who are poorly motivated, poorly led, and badly supplied.
All right, let me play devil's advocate on this, Elena Volochin, because Robert Parsons talking about the old playbook from the Chechen War from Syria, and we've seen those aerial images of the besieged city of Mariupol, with 90% of the buildings either destroyed or damaged. Does Russia have to play by the new rules, seeing as they don't seem to mind as much if they have casualties within their own ranks?
I think Mariupol is not negotiable for Vladimir Putin. He wants to seize it, and that's why they reduce the city into trashes today, because they have no other mean to take the city. Obviously, military. That's all they know how to do, is to blow up the city and to reduce it and to destroy it, and then they can take it. And Mariupol is today, maybe it will be the only great victory for Russia. The briefing that we heard today from the Ministry of Defense, it's very important one.
The Russian Ministry of Defense.
Yeah, the Russian Ministry of Defense. Of course, you know that's the side I'm listening to all day. It's the Russian side. So what they did say is that now, first of all, they said that the operation was going strictly according to the initial plan. So that's what they always say, is that everything is achieved and all the goals are achieved. We don't know what about the initial plan, because the only thing we were told by the official version was denazification and demilitarization of Ukraine. So we don't really know if Vladimir Putin wanted to seize the whole country or only this region of Donbass. But what they said is that they had two options: either to strike all Ukraine, either to strike only the Donbass to prevent this alleged genocide from the Ukrainian Nazis of the Russian populations from the Donbass. So they said, yes, we did right that we struck all over Ukraine because we prevented Ukrainians from preventing ourselves from saving this population.
That's enough to save face? That's enough to save face?
Actually, what we can learn now out of this briefing is that Mariupol is belonging to this Republic of Donetsk that has claimed its independence from Ukraine since 2014, and that Mariupol is probably going to be integrated in this republic, whatever the cost. But obviously, Russian military is in great difficulty all over the rest of the territory of Ukraine, and that's maybe why today the official version saying that we did right, that we strike over Ukraine, but it was only to prevent Ukrainian army from preventing us to achieve our goals.
Sorry,
Go ahead.
Yeah, there are a number of things I think you can say about this statement by the Chief of Staff of Russia, Sergei Rudskoy. First of all, he's not clear on what's meant by Donbass. They're talking about perhaps limiting it to...
Part of the Donbass is under Ukrainian government control, and part of it is under the separatist control.
Well, yes, that's correct. And what the Russians are out to do is get full control over the entire administrative area of both Donetsk and Luhansk. But they're also occupying territory to the west, to the southwest of the Donetsk People's Republic. Cities they've taken like Berdiansk, for instance, Melitopol, which form a corridor, and this could be the most important thing. They're not part of the Donbass region, but they form a corridor which leads to the Crimea. That may be the military objective that they'll settle on. But at the same time, Rudskoy was saying that all the objectives that were identified, laid out by President Putin at the beginning of the operation, remain in place. So what are we to take from that? If they're still talking about demilitarization, denazification, which, as Elena said, were the original goals of the operation, then nothing much has really changed.
Iris Makler, your thoughts on Vladimir Putin's street cred where you are?
Where I am, I was thinking about his street cred everywhere. The problem when you begin these adventures like this, especially when you're a despot and it's your initiative, perhaps even your sole initiative, is the deal is you have to succeed. So I think people here are looking at the fact that it's 28 days, that Kyiv is still standing, that the president is still in power, and looking at it and thinking, that's a blow to Russia's reputation and to Putin's reputation, and perhaps to Vladimir Putin's standing as well.
Yeah, and it's time perhaps for the Kremlinology segment of the show, and the question, where's Sergei Shoigu, Vladimir Putin's defense minister? Appearing Thursday in footage that was handed out by the Kremlin, Russian Security Council meeting, first time since February the 27th. But you don't really see him much. This is a video that's raised more questions than answers. Why is there no audio on that tape? Because that what we got. And secondly, that's all you see of Shoigu. Was he really live? Is that a taped loop? The Kremlin spokesperson says he's not gone anywhere. He's just very busy at his job. Your thoughts on that, Borzo Daragahi?
Well, it strikes me that we're back in this sort of Cold War. I'm old enough that I remember the Cold War. In this sort of Cold War, a kind of level of trying to parse what is happening in the Kremlin, making these guesses and speculations and so on. And meanwhile, we're also at this these sorts of tricks, these sort of Orwellian tricks of splicing someone's image in and out of photographs. They're very much part of the old Soviet Union. So maybe the more things change, the more they stay the same.
Elena Volochin, Sergei Shoigu is not just anybody. He's been defense minister for 10 years.
Yeah, definitely. With Sergei Lavrov, he's the right hand of Vladimir Putin. So indeed, I just noticed, thanks to you, that he had disappeared. I did not notice that, but you are absolutely right. Yeah, I don't see him at all. It's we see the two officials from the Russian Defense Ministry, Igor Konashenkov, who regularly does his briefing, and he's like a good soldier. He's repeating the aims have been achieved. We don't target civilians. We have destroyed so many military targets, etc., etc. But yes, I don't know. Maybe it's because now the only official strategic version has to be spread by Vladimir Putin himself, and Sergei Shoigu is more like a kind of a very high-rank official who could maybe put a shadow on the chief commander, who is Vladimir Putin today, with this great-scale military operation that he's leading. He wants to appear as a chief commander. He wants to see like he is controlling, he's in the game. So maybe that's why Sergei Shoigu is a little bit in the shadow, and we see just more like technical stuff, who is like just doing the job.
Maybe. I mean, it's interesting. You mentioned that Shoigu has been defense minister for the last 10 years, but he's been around for even longer than that. When I was a correspondent in Moscow in the 1990s and the beginning of the 2000s, he was already a minister. He was Minister of Emergency Affairs. So he's been around there for almost forever, and he's very, very close to Putin as well. But somebody's going to have to take the blame for what's gone wrong.
That's right.
I suspect that Sergei Shoigu is going to be the man. Plus, too, another one who's disappeared from view rather over the last couple of weeks is Gerasimov, the top general. Where is he? And what's he saying about what's going on?
Iris Mockler?
Yes, I was also a correspondent in Moscow at that time, and I do remember Shoigu from then. And I was discussing with someone very early in the war. I said, somebody's going to have to take the rap for this. Who will it be? They always ask in Russia, "Kto vinovat?" Who is guilty? And it can't be Vladimir Putin. So the defense minister is a natural fall guy. And a friend of mine who was working in Moscow for many years, she said to me, "Oh, he's not going to turn on Sergei Shoigu." And yet it's a real possibility. There has been a lot of, on Twitter, very amusing, Shoigu is originally from Siberia. They said, well, they can't send him to Siberia because he's from Siberia, all these kind of jokes. But it's a very real question, as it is with the two FSB leaders that Putin sidelined and are staying at home. So these are real questions, and I agree with Borzo. It is back to that kind of Kremlinologists looking in during Soviet times.
We saw the top security officials during this meeting, which prior to the war, where they were persuading Vladimir Putin.
Some of them were dressed down, as I recall.
Yes, exactly. That's the only moment where we saw all of them together. Actually, that was the first moment that we saw a public security council on television, because usually it's the closed meeting, it's like a working meeting, and then they staged it at the Russian state TV, like everything was very theatrical, even when Vladimir Putin, shouted at some officials who did not do the job, and we don't know if that was set up or was it an improvisation, but still, yes. And at this time, they were all persuading Vladimir Putin just before he made this announcement that he recognizes the separatist Republic of Donetsk and Luhansk. They were persuading him that this is very necessary to stop the genocide in Ukraine and so on and so on. That was the last time and the only time when we saw them prior to this operation.
Yeah. Let's stick to facts here. What is confirmed is Moscow's most high-profile defection so far. Vladimir Putin had once been himself a protege of Anatoly Chubais, when the longtime Kremlin advisor was the architect of Russia's 1990s pro-market reforms. Chubais against the invasion of Ukraine. He was on the record. And according to Moscow newspaper Kommersant, was seen withdrawing cash from an ATM in Turkey this week. Did you see any Russian men wearing baseball caps, Borzu?
Oh, there's so many Russians and Ukrainians in Turkey right now. They're and they're coming for the long haul. In Antalya, prices have skyrocketed as Russians and Ukrainians come and not just rent but buy flats to get out of Russia. It's a little bit sad because many of the people that are coming are journalists, intellectuals, scholars of various types, psychologists, people who are in these elite professions, a massive brain drain of people who just don't want to tolerate Putin's Russia anymore.
Yeah, and there is this brain drain that you mention. There's also right now the Ukrainians themselves fleeing the country. This Friday, the U.S. President Joe Biden taking a look at the humanitarian situation in eastern Poland. He also visited with the 82nd Airborne Division, meeting with soldiers at a base that's, just right near the Ukrainian border. There are now some 100,000 U.S. troops currently stationed in Europe. On Thursday, we had a triple summit day over in Brussels, and during those summits, it was again this feeling, Robert Parsons, of back to the Cold War. With NATO suddenly finding its renewed purpose, and Joe
Biden as well,
and Joe Biden as well.
Yeah, I mean, particularly after the debacle in Afghanistan, it was just a great opportunity for him to, really rally the troops together, so to speak. And that's precisely what he's been doing over the last 48 hours. That little speech he made to the soldiers of the 82nd Airborne at Rzeszów today in Poland, saying that these moments come along, every few generations. It's an inflection point in history. And here we are at one of those inflection points. Democracy facing down autocracy, and the soldiers of the 82nd Airborne were right at the point of that, and they were doing a great job.
So what are you saying? He's kind of on par with John F. Kennedy's Ich bin ein Berliner, or Ronald Reagan's tear down this wall?
That's the sort of image he's trying to put across at the moment.
Your thoughts on this, Iris Mockler?
Yes, I do also think it's a moment for Joe Biden. There's no doubt about that, and a moment for NATO too. To decide their red lines, to decide in a group way whether they can be strong. They did appear weak. That's one of the reasons that Vladimir Putin thought he could take this risk, this gamble, because he thought they would continue to be weak. And I'm not suggesting that sanctions are everything by any means, and they haven't come out in support of Ukraine militarily, as Zelensky is requesting over and over again. But nevertheless, you do see more spine, more determination, and perhaps in the end you will also see military support.
Military support in what way? They were quite emphatic, Iris, on Thursday. The leaders of the big powers said that it would be no to things like no-fly zones. The Poles wanted peacekeepers sent into Ukraine. That's not going to happen, say the big players in NATO for now.
For now, that's right. But the very fact that they are considering, setting up a red line of some sort with the use of chemical weapons, and I think perhaps unlike in Syria, that it actually will be a real red line, and they're communicating that back channel back to Moscow, I think that is significant. And it is something that Washington is doing, but Washington is also going to be doing in conjunction with NATO. There's no doubt about that. They won't do that just on their own, is what I mean. Sorry.
During the entirety of the Cold War, we never had a confrontation on the battlefield between the Soviets and NATO. And there's this fear that that could happen, Elena Volochin.
I think now Joe Biden is doing everything to avoid that. And I don't know what about the Americans, but looking from Russia and from Vladimir Putin's perspective, I can say that any step that the Americans and that NATO are taking to help Ukraine to defend itself, we're not even talking about physical military support, about like no-fly zone or for the US or NATO to sending troops, but only to supply Ukrainian army what they do actually now with weapons, etc. This is already a red line for Vladimir Putin, because initially his claims were that NATO would withdraw all its troops and its military equipment out of the 13 countries that integrated NATO since 1997. That was the very, very initial Putin's claim in December last year, which afterwards justified his invasion of Ukraine. Because why did Vladimir Putin officially, according to his version, has invaded Ukraine? He said NATO is threatening him, and only the military presence, like he's like in Orwell, you know, he's making war to have peace. And he's saying that if we would not make war in Ukraine to push backwards NATO would attack us. That's what Vladimir Putin is pretending. So any step that NATO is taking, not only not to withdraw from Europe, but to increase military presence only with weapons and with military support to Ukraine, is already seen from Vladimir Putin's side and from Vladimir Putin's perspective as a signal that he must increase the confrontation. The other question is that does he have the means to do that?
Does he have the means? By the way, Thursday's summit in Brussels making for some unlikely photo ops. We saw the president of France and Turkey shaking hands. They've had their words of late over things like Ankara's symbiotic ties to Muslim groups abroad, over French arms sales to Greece. It's also a reminder when we look at these pictures, Borzo Daragahi, that Turkey, which is a neighbor to both Russia and Ukraine, is also a NATO member.
It's absolutely true, but you know, tensions between France and Turkey started going down immediately after the war was lost by Khalifa Haftar in Libya. So after that, they let bygones be bygones. So it's been a couple years when relations have been improving. Turkey is an important, it's not quite a neighbor to Russia, but they do share the Black Sea. And so maybe you could call, they're both littoral states to the Black Sea, which is a crucial element of this whole conflict. But, you know, I mean, I think Turkey is playing a very interesting game. I think there's a bunch, as you've pointed out, a bunch of countries that are trying to play both sides. And I think each does it for their own reason. Turkey does it for its own reason. Israel does it for its own reason. The Gulf countries do it for their own reasons. And I think that it's really important to note that there are a whole bunch of African, Latin American, Asian countries that do not share the European and Western view of Putin as this, you know, horrible menace and so on. I don't agree with those countries, but it's important to note that there are countries that are still supportive of Russia, even countries that still consider Putin some kind of role model. And so I think that is one important aspect. If you want to, I'll leave it at that, but if you want to ask more specifically about the Turkey-Russia dynamic, we can do that as well.
Well, actually, Borzu, earlier you mentioned that brain drain from Russia towards Turkey at this time that you've witnessed yourself. It's also got other kinds of visitors in town. We could show images of the Eclipse, which belongs to Chelsea owner Roman Abramovich. It's the Russian oligarch's second super yacht to dock in Turkey in the past few days. Abramovich, who seems to find that it's a good place to park your boat.
I mean, Turkey is almost completely dependent on Russian gas. It is dependent on food and grain supplies, interestingly, from both Russia and Ukraine. And so it's in a tough situation. It also has a whole bunch of security arrangements, very complicated deals with Russia in Syria and in the Caucasus, as well as in North Africa. And so it's kind of, I don't think Turkey historically likes Russia. Turkey used to, this Crimea that we talk about used to be part of the Ottoman Empire. And has a long Muslim history and so on. And so, I don't think they particularly like each other, but they're really dependent on each other. And so Turkey sees itself as in no position to come out and put sanctions on Russia and start seizing oligarchs' boats and upsetting the Russians too much. On the other hand, it is by all accounts maybe more quietly now flooding Ukraine with Bayraktar drones that are proving devastating against Russian armor.
Yeah, and in the interest of fairness, since we're talking about Russian oligarchs, Roman Abramovich, like several of his peers, holds an Israeli passport. The Israeli newspaper Haaretz wondering if those, quote, refugees in private jets might reshape the country's economy. Is that hyperbole, Iris Makler?
At the moment, yes. I think this would be a very useful bolt hole for them, but what we are seeing more of here actually is simply refugees rather than super rich refugees who also have Israeli citizenship. And Israel is also playing a double game. It's pretending or putting itself forward as a mediator, but its motives are really front and center about Iran. There's two parallel stories going on in the world at the same time, and they connect here because Russia has a presence in Syria. As the Israeli foreign minister says, Russia is actually on our border. Russia is our neighbor. And what Israel wants to do is to ensure that Iran doesn't take up a permanent presence in Syria, either itself or by a proxy, as it has in Lebanon. And at first they thought that Russia would do that for them, that Russia would enforce an area where Iran couldn't get to. And Russia didn't do that. So what there is a deal, if you like, between Russia and Israel, that Israel can enforce that. And so it attacks Iranian targets inside Syria. There's almost daily contact. There's regular contact. There's military coordination, sometimes daily contact between the Russians and the Israeli military so that they don't make any more mistakes when there was one. And I think all of that is the reason that Israel is not being as critical as I think the public here is very supportive of Ukraine. Many parliamentarians are very supportive of Ukraine. And yet Israel is walking that line where you walk down the middle and both sides criticize you.
There's some saying that if not for Russia invading Ukraine and putting new conditions on the Iran nuclear deal negotiations to which they're a party, that the ink would already be dry on rekindling that 2015 agreement, Iris.
That's right. I mean, just look at the timing. We were being told, there's many people watching that in Israel because they oppose it and in the rest of other countries because they want it to go through. So it was meant to happen in actually the week that the Russian military operation began. And every week since then, it's been delayed and delayed and delayed. And I don't think that anyone would have thought at the beginning that the road to an Iran nuclear deal would go through Kyiv.
Borzu Dargahi?
I think that I think the Russian issue got resolved on the nuclear deal. The Russians wanted to make sure that exemptions on their nuclear, that there would be sanctions exemptions on their nuclear cooperation with Iran in case the JCPOA went through. The Biden administration okayed that, but there's other major issues with regard to the Iran deal that are holding it up, and that's mostly about the status of the Revolutionary Guard. One thing that I think is really interesting, it just sort of occurred to me, is just how badly, and just listening to all the speakers, how badly Putin has has failed in all of his goals. He wanted to denazify Ukraine. And instead, Ukrainian nationalism has peaked. Even Russian-speaking Ukrainians are coming out on the side of the Ukrainian government. He wanted to demilitarize Ukraine. So many weapons, Stingers, javelins, drones are flooding into the country. Every single person in that country is learning to be a fighter and a soldier, even like housewives and social media influencers. He wanted to break up NATO and keep NATO farther from his borders. And you have 100,000 troops, as you mentioned, flooding into those Eastern European countries like Romania and Hungary and Slovakia and so on the border there, and Poland, of course. He wanted to show the contradictions in NATO and break them up. And NATO has found a new purpose. It has found a new reason for its existence. So it's just the unfathomable failure of Vladimir Putin in achieving any of his goals, even if he ends up taking a few cities.
And I can add one more, and I'll put it to you, Robert Parsons, which is right now there's an EU summit which is running over. One of the main issues, and we heard Germany today vowing it would be stopping its imports of Russian oil and gas by the end of 2024. It's going to be very hard to do, but they want to do it. Europe's stopping the purchases of Russian hydrocarbons. They're getting closer to it, it seems.
Yeah, I mean, Boris was absolutely right. This is a catastrophe for Vladimir Putin and his plans for the future of Russia. Everything that could go wrong has gone devastatingly wrong. He's not achieving anything in Ukraine, just one or two cities where he's making progress. As Boris said, he's unified the Ukrainian people around their leadership. He's remotivated NATO. He's re-energized the European Union. He's not achieved what Elena was talking about earlier on, the pushback of NATO's forces from the European countries that joined NATO after 1997. Everywhere you look. Plus, the economy is going to be absolutely trashed now. If the West stops importing Russian energy, that's about half of Russia's GDP is going to go down the tubes. It's absolutely catastrophic. And all that will be left for Russia will be go begging to Beijing, which for Russians, believe me, is a catastrophe. That's almost every Russian's nightmare, to be in the pocket of Beijing.
And that brings us to what has been the new normal for Elena this past week, which is, as you said earlier, your job has been to watch what's coming out of Russian media. And we know that 70% of the population supports Vladimir Putin.
79% according to an official
79%. Thank you
poll.
for the
We
correction.
have to be very cautious with opinion polls in Russia, but now the official poll shows almost 80%.
So when
support to
Robert
Vladimir
Parsons paints that picture, is that going to change?
That's very much from a Western perspective, if I may. And as a Russian and as a person in being in charge in Moscow for 10 years, I can say that I am very much afraid of what Vladimir Putin is doing today. And it's very dangerous and very risky to say that he has failed, because Vladimir Putin doesn't like to lose, he doesn't like to fail, and he won't fail in either way. What it means is that he will find a way to say that he has won, and what the way he can find can be whatever will be the worst scenario for the West. It can be a chemical attack, it can be a nuclear attack, it can be just whatever. I shall remember that.
But he's not suicidal either, yeah.
We don't know that. We don't know that. Let me just remind you that in his speech, the 22nd of February, he said, "You may adapt any sanctions on us. It won't hurt us anyway." And he knew that the West would be adopted. Why did he say that?
How about the oil and gas? How about
the oil and gas will just flow in the pockets of Russian oligarchs who will still be, Vladimir Putin is the top chief oligarch in Russia, and he will just keep all the rich, all the incomes for himself, and whatever he already said, we want to be paid in rubles, which is a total nonsense when you know the course of what I mean here is that Vladimir Putin is really not concerned at all about the welfare of his population, about the welfare of his economy. And if he doesn't rule with the support of population, he will rule with the fear of population. Look, we saw North Korea earlier on in our news editions. What happens there? People are starving, people are dying, and the guy, he's still in power for decades. His father, his grandfather was, and nothing changed. And he just ruled because it's a dictatorship and the rule of fear. And Vladimir Putin, I repeat
but there are limits. There are limits. We saw with the Soviet Union in Afghanistan. At the end, the Soviets were tired.
The
of
end
fighting.
of every
Russian
Russian dynasty ends in war. In a failed war.
To provoke a full-scale war that like we did not have since this World War II. Is it a limit? It's not for Vladimir Putin. What could be a limit for Vladimir Putin? I'm very much afraid when we say that Vladimir Putin is failing, because I know that...
Objectively speaking, he is failing.
Yes, but Vladimir Putin does not have the same reality than you and I, Rob.
He may survive as leader of his country.
We don't care about his reality.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Objectively, he's failing. At the moment, Russia, before this conflict started, Russia had an economy slightly smaller than that of Italy.
But the war is not over.
Borzo Dargahi, the war is not over, says Elena.
No matter what, even if he manages to take control of Ukraine, all of Ukraine, he puts his own puppet in Kyiv, it'll turn into a massive, ugly insurgency. Look at the determination of these people. It will mean thousands of Russian deaths. It will mean, terrorist attacks in Moscow by Ukrainian fighters. It is going to be, there's no end game, there's no win here. There's no exit strategy that will salvage a defeat. He can spin it however he wants. He can lie to his own people. He can control the media. But objectively speaking, there's just no winnable scenario here.
All right. No winnable scenario for him. Is there a winnable scenario for France's opposition? Because, this story has hogged the limelight, as you can see. The French election campaign has been reduced to near naught. By the way, we're seeing it's on April the 10th, and there are plenty of the 12 candidates who've had cozy relationships with the Kremlin in the past. On Wednesday, though, all you heard were cheers when Ukraine's president addressed the French parliament. Volodymyr Zelensky's audience included 4 members of parliament who are challengers to incumbent Emmanuel Macron. Of the 4, only the Green candidate is staunchly anti-Putin and pro-EU. With the others, you kind of have to read between the lines when they interpret his speech.
It was an emotional speech about the suffering of Ukrainians, but he wants to drag us into this war, and I don't think this is the way to make peace. What disappointed me was that he did not propose a peace plan, and I regret that, because we want to alleviate the suffering of Ukrainians. A peace plan was not proposed, and I have already proposed one.
All right, Iris Makler for information. Nicolas Dupont-Aignan is polling at less than 2%. But what are your thoughts when you listen to what he said?
People who are more across European and French politics, because from here, I can't. The nuance is beyond me right now. I'm going to leave that to you guys in the studio.
All right. Saying, at no time did he propose a peace plan. What I regret is that precisely to alleviate the suffering of the Ukrainians, a peace plan was not proposed, Robert Parson.
It's ludicrous. Ukraine is under attack from Russia. Ukraine can propose as many peace plans as it likes to Putin at the moment, but it's quite clear that he's not interested in peace.
All right.
Others can suggest ideas as well. Maybe Mr. Dupont as well can suggest his ideas it's going to be a non-flyer, but he can suggest it.
Right, and he's polling at less than 2%. Marine Le Pen, according to surveys, will be in the second round, the leader of the far right, who, by the way, first said she had a scheduling conflict and wouldn't be attending Wednesday's specialist session of Parliament. In the end, the far right standard bearer did take her seat, all the while arriving late. She has sort of denounced the invasion of Ukraine, Elena Volochin.
That's very sad, because I covered Marine Le Pen's paying visit to Vladimir Putin in 2017 during the presidential campaign. And at the time, we did not understand why a presidential candidate would come to see Vladimir Putin during the campaign. We also remember that in 2015, her party, Front National, at this time has received, or was it 2014? Yeah, received some loans from a Russian bank to finance the electoral campaign. And at that time, people were criticizing Marine Le Pen. And now today, where the mask has failed, and everyone discovers that Vladimir Putin is a dictator who's attacking Ukraine. But I shall remember that Marine Le Pen, during all this time, she was justifying the annexation of Crimea, the war in the Donbass. She was spreading also this Kremlin propaganda that there was a legitimate referendum in Crimea from population who wanted to attach to Russia, that NATO was threatening Russia, and that's why Russian would have to. I mean, this is all the rumors, the loudspeakers of Russian propaganda in France, and today they are like they are trapped with the reality that they did not see coming. I don't know how sincere she was all this time, not seeing who really was Vladimir Putin, but I find this really sad and very hypocrite what happens now.
Earlier in our conversation, Borzo Daragahi, you were saying how in the rest of the world, there's plenty of places where they don't see it as a binary choice when it comes to this invasion of Ukraine by Russia. We're also hearing people from the far left in France who are not on the take, they're not accepting money from the Kremlin, but who say, NATO perhaps went too far, this kind of speech.
I mean, you have these anti-imperialist types in the left who are basically, they see everything that the West does as evil and everything that the West's rivals do as good. I think that, I don't think they have a very integral intellectual position, let's put it that way. But I think what is interesting is the extent to which Russia, over the last 20 years or so, has managed to infiltrate Western democracies, not just France, but also Hungary, any country, basically anywhere where it has an opportunity. They tend to support far-right parties, but there's also far left parties that they seem to have some kind of ties to. And right now this has put a lot of them in very uncomfortable positions. They want this to just go away, like someone like Viktor Orban, who has an election coming up next weekend. They just want this issue to go away. It's the one issue that is giving him pause at this point. But that is something that is really extraordinary. There's been a lot of research about it. There's an interesting article in the New Lines magazine about the leaked documents that show relations between Russian oligarchs close to the Kremlin and these far-right parties.
Yeah, and just a reminder, in that speech that Volodymyr Zelensky gave before the French Parliament, it wasn't those opposition candidates that he chastised, but rather French corporations.
Tanks, anti-tank weapons, combat aircraft, air defenses, you can help us. We need help so that freedom does not lose. The world must support with sanctions against the aggressor. Every week there should be a package of new sanctions. French companies must leave the Russian market, Renault, Leroy Merlin, Auchan, and others. They must stop sponsoring the Russian war machine.
Cessez d'être les sponsors de la machine de guerre de la Russie.
All right, so some naming and shaming, Robert Parsons. Renault, the French car maker, which has since announced that it's suspending operations. Not so for
there are other big names,
those big distribution
like Auchan,
chains.
for instance.
Yeah, the supermarket chain.
Yeah, I mean, they're looking at their profits. That's all. I think they're not going to pull out. Some have been named and shamed, and they've decided it's in their interest to get out now, that the future in Russia doesn't look good, but others who have invested so heavily, even Renault, who you just mentioned, is being careful about how it does its withdrawal. It's keeping its operation going in part of the automobile industry in Russia.
At what point does politics matter more than money?
The position of French big business in Russia has always been like that, like very pragmatic, very much in the realpolitik. Like no matter what happens on the political stage, but we are just here for business. And the business community in Russia has also very much been criticizing Western media, who was, according to them, demonizing Vladimir Putin, and they were also spreading this version that Russia being trapped and threatened by the US and NATO, etc. They are very much also in this perspective. I'm just talking about the Russian affairs community that have been spoken to through all these years. And I think Volodymyr Zelensky, he's very pragmatic too. That's all he can ask to France is to stop its economical presence in Russia, because he knows that diplomatically France has no role to play in this negotiation, and that is up to the United States. But really, French companies are today the last ones which really remains massively in Russia, despite the Russian aggression of Ukraine.
That will be the last word, unfortunately, for now. Much more to talk about here. Elena Velicin, I want to thank you. I want to thank as well Robert Parsons, Borzu Daragahi in Istanbul, Iris Makler in Jerusalem. Thank you for being with us here in The World This Week.